guys, Amy here. I just wanted to check in with your week 3 discussion. This is our first peer review workshop discussion of one of your major essays, and so I'll comment here on things that you need to know for the essay as well as things that you'll need to know for how to complete the peer review portion of the assignment. And so I did look through and read over all of your rough drafts. If you would like individual feedback on your rough draft, that's something that we have to do over email in either a video or a phone conference. So I am willing to look at all of your rough drafts and give you feedback more in depth, but it needs to be in a way that is going to be conducive to us kind of talking back and forth and having a conversation, because it's impossible to provide that kind of feedback in a one-way direction. And so just please email me if you would like to do some extra work with me on that. And then I also wanted to just point out that you guys did for the most part, really good job getting your rough drafts posted on time, and that the rest of you who didn't post on time will actually need to well, you'll lose 10% from this assignment, and then in future assignments, make sure that you do post your rough drafts on time so that you don't get that penalty. Okay, so I just wanted to, as far as the content goes, address a couple of things that I saw as I was reading over everyone's rough drafts. The first thing I want to talk about is how to introduce the article properly. And then I pulled out a couple of examples here that actually came from your rough drafts. And I saw a few things happening, and I want to talk a little bit about sentence structure and how to negotiate all this complex information, you know, the author, the title, the publication source, and the publication date in a grammatically correct way in that first sentence. So the example I have here at the top, this is a really common mistake that writers make, where they want to start out with a prepositional phrase in the article. I have that highlighted in green here. In is a preposition because prepositions are spatial terms, so they relate to anything that would have to do with you know, spatial alignment, in, beside, under, over, through. Those are all prepositions. So if you start out a sentence with a phrase that begins with a preposition, you have to set that off with a comma. So we see here in the article, How Twitter Will Change the Way We Live by Steven Johnson, published online for Times Magazine on June 5th, 2009, comma. So this is all the prepositional phrase in this case. It's got some information that's been injected that's also set off with a comma, like the publication information. But in general, the entire prepositional phrase is followed with a comma. The problem here is that the verb states, the verb part of the attribution here isn't tied directly to a subject. Now we all know that a complete sentence needs to have a subject and a verb, but in this case the subject, the article, is part of the prepositional phrase, so there's no true subject for this verb. So now if we see that all of this is part of the prepositional phrase, there's no subject to act on the verb states here. So in fact, this prepositional phrase isn't enough to just add this verb at the end. You actually need the true author tag, Johnson states, because the article doesn't state. The article published online on June 5th states. That would make sense, but because the word in is here, this is subordinate, and you need another subject here. So this one is incorrect. Let's look at a couple of correct examples and see if this can make more sense. The article, How Twitter Will Change the Way We Live, written by Steven Johnson, that was published on June 5th, 2009, discusses. So in this case, we don't have the preposition. We just have the article discusses. So if you took off the word in for this first example, the article states would make sense, but because you have the word in, this all becomes a prepositional phrase and you need another subject before the verb. So here's another example that does include the prepositional phrase. In the article published online for Time Magazine on June 20th, 2010, titled Web Privacy in Praise of Oversharing, Steven Johnson discusses blah blah blah. So this one is correct because it has the prepositional phrase, it has the verb, but it also has the subject for the verb tied directly to it right here. And then this last one is just another way of going about it that is also correct. In his Time magazine article, How Twitter Will Change the Way We Live, published online online on January 21st, 2010, Stephen Johnson discusses the impact that Twitter has had on society. And that's correct. Subject, verb, this is the prepositional phrase, and it's all punctuated correctly. So just keep that in mind. You can't have the prepositional phrase at the beginning unless you repeat the subject right before the verb, like we saw here. Or if you don't want to repeat the subject before the verb, you can just take the preposition off of the beginning and say the article discusses or the article states. Or you can do it this way, which is also correct. Okay, so that's just some notes about introducing the article. I also wanted to comment on your representations of the author's thesis statement because that was the biggest place where I saw you guys struggling. So I pulled out a few examples of each of the different articles, and I want to talk about places that we might be able to revise some of these thesis statements to be a little bit more accurate. So remember, a thesis statement is comprehensive. It states the author's overall argument and their actual position on the topic being discussed, and it usually will also encompass the main supporting points. And so that's what you want to be looking for when you're paraphrasing the thesis is, what is the author's position on the topic and what are the points that they use to support that position. So for the Dawn of the Digital Natives article, let's take a look at a few examples that I saw of the theses that you guys pulled out in your summaries. So here's the first one. Johnson calls into question the accuracy of a report conducted by the National Endowment for the Arts on the percentage of readers dropping in our society in recent years. Johnson argues that the numbers are not as alarming as the NEA report portrays, stating in almost every study screen-based reading is excluded from the data. Here's another one. Stephen Johnson's Dawn of the Digital Natives, written on February 7, 2008, explains that the National Endowment of the Arts has reported a recent drop in reading of all ages. Johnson states that we are cycling through yet another Johnny Can't Read mini panic, sparked by the release of a National Endowment for the Arts study called To Read or Not to Read. And then here's a third. Is reading becoming obsolete? According to a National Endowment for the Arts study called To Read or Not to Read, America has a literacy crisis. According to the chairman of the NEA, Dana Goya, claims, the story the data tell is simple, consistent, and alarming. Reading for fun has been on a 7% decline for adults and a 12% decline for 18 to 24-year-olds. Not so fast, says Stephen Johnson, author of Dawn of the Digital Natives. Studies are extremely one-sided when viewing the Google generation. Johnson points out that even though the charts show a 5-point drop in reading skills concerning 17-year-olds since 1988, there's a 7-point leap regarding 9-year-olds since 1999. Okay, what do all of these examples have in common? Well, they all start with the National Endowment for the Arts study. That's a problem because this author's argument isn't in line with the study, it's actually in opposition to the study. And so the study represents the context or the motivating occasion for this piece of writing, but it's not the author's thesis. The author's thesis is that reading is not on the decline, and in fact, young people today are reading more than ever, and then there's a couple other benefits that he provides. So instead of starting out with the opposite position, you need to start out with this author's position and the main points that he uses to support that position. And so we're going to see this again in just a few minutes, but in general there's a lesson here about the fact that sometimes chronology is not the best way to structure your summary. It's not best to go through the article in the order that the ideas appear in the article. You want to start your summary with this author's thesis. So put Johnson's position right up front, and then you can go back and explain the NEA study. I also pulled these examples out because there's a couple of other things we can learn from them. This is a good example of what I was talking about before in terms of you not only have to say the topic, but you have to say the position. So this is definitely the topic that he's discussing, but what is his position on it? Is he saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing, and why? This is a good example here of why quoting is sometimes not the best way to summarize. In this case, the quote is accurate, but it wouldn't make sense to someone when taken out of context if they hadn't read the original article already. And so it would be better to put this in your own words so that you could make it make sense outside of the structure of the original article. And then this one down here is a really good example of letting evidence come to the forefront rather than main ideas and points. None of this detailed information about 7%, 12%, 18 to 24, 9-year-olds, 1988, 1999 should be in the summary. Those are all specific facts. Even the chair of the NEA's name is too specific to include in a summary. So really, you just need to generalize about the point that the writer is trying to use this information to make, not quote the information itself, because this doesn't really show me that you've understood. So here, instead, you could make a general statement about the fact that, maybe reading for pleasure seems to be on the decline, but really Johnson is arguing that there is a growth in the numbers rather than a drop, or you'd probably even have to change the language further. I'm just speaking off the top of my head here, but how would you pull this into your own words and represent the idea that he's arguing for, not just the factual information that he uses to support that argument? All right, let's look at some examples from the Twitter article. There's a couple of good paraphrase examples in here, but again, we're going to see the same issues that we saw with the dawn of the digital natives, which is too much quoting that doesn't make sense out of context, and too specific examples to really get at the thesis. The other thing we'll see is that oftentimes it takes writers a few sentences to get to the thesis, but in your revisions you need to go back and find a way to get to the thesis right away, right at the beginning, as soon as you introduce the article. So here, this example. He contends that since the inception of Twitter, many followers of the site have come to realize that there is a great deal more to Twitter than initially thought. This is a really good start. But again, it doesn't say the position that the writer takes. Does he think this is a good thing or a bad thing? And you could also do more to directly preview the supporting points here, in the sense that you could say exactly what is there more to Twitter than initially thought. So what are the points he makes about the good things about it? This is another example of where the quotes don't make sense when taken out of context. Oops, I'm sorry. That's for the dawn of the digital natives. Okay, going back to Twitter. Stephen Johnson discusses the impact that Twitter has had on society. Johnson acknowledges that many people may have a negative view of the social media site due to its reputation of simply being a way to send trivial 140-character updates to followers about breakfast cereal choices. However, he proceeds to analyze the unsuspected depth of Twitter, the various ways that users have discovered to manipulate Twitter's basic functions, have altered social interaction and information sharing. Johnson argues the most fascinating thing about Twitter is not what it's doing to us, but what we're doing to it. So I think this is also really close. It just gets a little too specific when we talk about these examples about 140 character updates or breakfast cereal choices. You can generalize about the fact that it seems trivial, but at least in the thesis, this is way too specific. In the body of the summary, you might expound on these points a little bit more. So I would take this out. A negative view of the social media site. However, it has unsuspected depth. A lot of you use words like analyze and inform in your thesis statements. Be clear, he is trying to persuade you. He's being persuasive, not analytical, not informative. So I think that the rest of this is pretty strong. Let's look at this example. Stephen Johnson's article describes the evolution of Twitter and the lasting impact and legacy it may have on the future. It was published for Time magazine on June 5th, 2009. Contains numerous points to describe phenomena such as wide spectrum conversations, independency of the follower base, additions by followers themselves, and how it may be the best platform to move on. I think that this is really strong. If you moved this up into the previous sentence and went straight into the thesis, Stephen Johnson's article describes the evolution of Twitter and the lasting impact on the future, contains numerous points as to why it may have a lasting impact. I think you could still be a little more precise that he thinks this is a good thing, but in general, this is probably the best paraphrase of the main reasons why that I saw in this writer's own words. All right, quickly, let's look at the oversharing article. The reason I pulled out these three examples is because they all have in common that they don't say which side of the argument Johnson is on. They both say, he debates the benefits of sharing and the hazards of oversharing, discusses the possible gains and the concern for personal privacy, discusses the pros and cons of making so much of our lives public. You need to show in your summary which side this writer's on. That's the goal. You're representing his argument. And so make sure that you say not just pros and cons or gains and concerns or benefits and hazards. Make sure that you're actually saying which of those things Johnson is arguing for. So that's really what I wanted to pull out. I wanted to show you guys that, you know, you could do a little more to represent the thesis and introduce the articles. But otherwise, good job.